Let's talk to Jake about it. I believe he's here. Welcome. Come on down. Ooh, the
There
big
he is.
Celsius. I got the small
Yes.
Celsius mogged.
Cheers.
Cheers. Cheers, Jake. How you doing?
I'm good. How you guys doing?
Doing fantastic. Can you give us the update? What did you announce? What are you doing? What are you building? What's behind you?
Oh, so behind me is our lab. This is a BSL2, so biosafety level 2 facility. So this is a biosafety cabinet.
Mm-hmm.
So we're handling any like pathogens, like any anthrax or botulinum. We're going to be doing it in there,
Cool.
just for protection of the operator. But yeah, so we just announced a $3.25 million round,
Mm-hmm.
um, led by Peter Thiel, Cantos, and
Congrats.
Refactor Capital to transform really the battlefield with advanced biotechnology. And really, if we consider like the state of affairs today, military medicine hasn't really changed much since Vietnam. We've seen a little bit of improvement in tactical combat casualty care, but we very much still have warfighters who are going on the front lines and dying in combat. So, what we're trying to build here is really advanced and novel biotechnology that we can really equip warfighters with to make them more, more lethal, more resilient, and more ready in combat environments. So initially, applications of that look like a nanocomposite for rapid wound healing,
Mm-hmm.
along with something we're exploring with more intelligence partners, which is a novel like biosurveillance network that would effectively be able to monitor for biological and chemical threats.
I remember reading about quick clot back in the day.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me about the evolution in just wound healing on the battlefield, kind of the different eras and where you see it going with your company?
Yeah, so QuickClaw is a really, really interesting example. It was started by a guy named Frank Hersey, and they basically, this guy would cut himself when he was shaving, and he realized that this mineral called zeolite, he would pour it on his skin, and it would stop the bleeding.
Yeah.
The challenge with QuickClaw, at least its initial formulation, was that it used to burn warfighters, so it actually would cause like second or third degree burns. So it would effectively stop the hemorrhage, but it would also burn them in the process of doing that. And they've now transitioned the technology, but really the issue with the traditional QuickClaw idea and the concept is that it might have supported warfare in a more traditional context where we can medevac that troop. But military is heading towards, like the military doctrine is heading towards this environment where, troops are going to be deployed in combat for an extended period of time. And military medics, we won't even be able to retract them for maybe upwards of 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So, the almost in many ways, the definition of what a casualty is changing. It's not somebody who's just been shot and is completely, completely gone. It's now somebody who can't even pull the trigger. So what we're trying to explore with Kingsfoil is moving beyond just that initial hemorrhage control and that hemostatic agent and building a product that would actually enable the warfighter to heal faster, so reducing that convalescent period and having them return to duty sooner.
Talk as much as you can about sort of broad, I would call it almost like drug use in the military. I've heard stories of fighter pilots. The funny thing is, from what I know, when F-35 pilots are deploying to the Middle East, they just sort of like take off here in the U.S. and they just fly
right
there. And you can imagine it's a pretty long flight. Anybody that's been on a 16-hour flight to the Middle East
Pretty
doing
brutal.
a little fundraising, it's you usually want to fall asleep at some point. Adderall and some of these sort of like
Modafinil was the big one.
those types of drugs are obvious. World War II has some crazy examples.
Yeah.
Would love to hear the history of like kind of drug use in the military, super abbreviated, everything from like stimulants to stuff more like quick clot.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the medications you guys mentioned are typically categorized as no and no go. So your stimulants, and then you have like your Z pills or your benzodiazepines to help with drowsiness. And look, it's really interesting. The military is relatively constrained for what they can actually provide to warfighters. I've heard some crazy stories. I think I heard the story about an Air Force a pilot who he basically took a bunch of benzos and he was like unable to fall asleep, so he started taking more and ended up like trying to like go use the bathroom and started like completely pissing himself. So they don't have like a lot of control over, and they don't really I would say they don't really advise how to use them so well. But modafinil is definitely a big one for vigilance and awareness. Obviously, your benzodiazepine class is pretty big as well, although the military is trying to move away from those. So there's quite a broad history here. But really, I don't think pharmacological is necessarily the right or immediate approach. I think in many ways we should be targeting the more of the root causes. So, for example, one of the early technologies we were exploring was a device called NewSleep, which is a closed loop brain-computer interface that would effectively shock you to sleep. And this has been a really big point of interest for the military is, can we build neuromodulation or brain stimulation devices that can control sleep architecture and make it so when warfighters sleep 3 hours, they really feel like they're sleeping 5 hours, right? So we're trying to find alternatives that are not addictive or habit forming and don't really carry that those secondary or next day effects that many benzodiazepines would.
Talk about
Yeah.
talk about sort of like dual use applications of sort of stuff on your roadmap, right? I imagine there's some things that you're developing that are going to be so powerful that eventually we'll want to get consumers will be like, hey, we want some of that too, right? And there's a long history of the sort of military.
And aren't you a consumer of this stuff? I see pictures of you testing it yourself.
So whenever we're thinking about a new initiative, my brain immediately goes to the dual use implication. And that's sort of one of the beautiful things we get to do at this intersection of biotech and defense. A lot of the companies today that are getting funded are building like cruise missiles, and you can't really sell that to the consumer or civilian population, right?
John wants some
I'm really into
drones.
big game hunting, and I want to take it to the next level, move past the sniper rifles and the long guns and go into the kamikaze drones and the cruise missiles. That's my goal for this year. But I take your point. Yeah. So continue. Sorry.
But yeah, so we're consistently thinking about that dual use implication, and really in many ways I see the DoD and our work with federal partners as a launch pad, right? We kind of get to offload a lot of this initial experimental and financial risk, kind of deploy it into this first customer market, and be able to eventually leverage that market for really extreme validation in the most austere conditions, and then bring it back to the civilian market. So practically everything we're building has a dual use implication.
Yep.
And I think another interesting implication as well is that, a lot of technology we're building is potentially maybe too early for the civilian market. So we kind of get that initial footing with a partner who can actually help us build out the technology, provide us with the necessary revenue to grow as a company and really, grow as an organization and grow out our product portfolio, and eventually bring it back to the market when it's the right time for civilians.
We were just talking to Delian about kind of the continuing resolution and the fact that the DoD isn't adding a lot of new programs. You're obviously still in the early stages here, kind of seed round level. Are you thinking about, hey, let's just go heads down for a couple of years, R&D, and then sprint towards program of record? Or are you seeing there's pockets of money that you can be responsive to and little programs that you can build up very quickly?
Yeah. So we're pretty aggressive with our approach. One of the last conferences we went to present our technology, we got like removed by armed security and present to PMs on garbage bins outside the conference center. So we're definitely in the mode of trying to get our technology in the warfighters' hands. That's sort of the chasm we're trying to cross here. Is that if you look at the state of things today, academia rules military medicine, and they do a horrible, like totally shitty job of taking technology from the benchtop to the battlefield. So the way we've been approaching things is thinking like, how can I build something in 4 months that we can then present to a federal partner, get it in the hands of the warfighter, and deploy this rapidly? So QuickClot, which is an example you brought up, got cleared in 9 months with no human trials, right? So there's kind of this really interesting opportunity for us to leverage the DoD and FDA memorandums, which enable expedited approval and clearance. And notably, like big companies right now, big startups like Neuralink and Synchron, like these big brain-computer interface companies, which have breakthrough designation, which was, prized as like the fastest, most expedited pathway in the FDA. If you work with the DoD, you can move faster, right? Sure. So there's this really interesting opportunity for us to build technology and actually get it in the hands of the warfighter and make sure that the troops we're putting in the most austere conditions aren't just surviving, but they're thriving, right? It's really hard to ask a 20-year-old to go into combat without the tools that they need to survive.
I'm curious how much of what you're developing is based on sort of studies that have existed for a long time that just nobody cared about, right? Like I imagine there's just this treasure trove of like information and research that people just never acted on, and now that you sort of this high agency, you have this like kind of core thesis for the company. I imagine there's a lot of basically like off balance sheet R&D work that you can just kind of absorb and sort of run with.
Yeah. So the first thing I'll mention, I think Palmer actually said this, which is that he hasn't really invented anything new because a lot of these concepts are already in sci-fi, and growing up being a big sci-fi reader, a lot of the ideas I have are coming directly out of science fiction. So rapid wound healing, artificial and synthetic blood, biosurveillance and biodefense. So yeah, a lot of these are deeply tied to fiction because of the limited constraints on the reality. But in terms of existing literature, we really do stand on the shoulders of giants. I think my primary skill set has been, how do I take really compelling literature from this one field that has no real practical application and combine it with something else, right? And kind of find these really interesting points of convergence between different ideas and turn that into a practical product, right? So in many ways, we do a really good job at taking, this cutting edge research and perfecting it. And I owe a lot to academia for that. And that's really, in my view, the role academia should be serving, right? Academia should be that foundational, doing that breakthrough science without very much thinking about the translational ability. But then you do need that partner to cross that bridge and actually build technology that can translate and get in the hands of the warfighter. And that's what we're trying to do at Pilgrim.
That makes sense. The Biological Weapons Convention in 1972 said the development, production, acquisition, transfer, stockpiling, and use of biological and toxins are effectively prohibited. So bioweapons are illegal, but that doesn't mean they're not going to be used, right? Do you think the DoD, if I'm a soldier being deployed to some far off land to fight some enemy that I don't know what their sort of ethics are, I don't know if they're going to follow the sort of laws right against these things. Maybe they get super desperate. Do you think that the DoD generally takes these sort of threats seriously enough? And I imagine, a lot of the stuff you're thinking about is reactionary to, a certain situation on the battlefield. How do you make sure that you're keeping our warfighters safe in a sort of unpredictable environment?
Totally. So first off, the DoD has a very kinetic frame of reference. So when they're thinking about things and threats, they're thinking about big, shiny explosions. I always joke with our team that I wish there was more explosions in bio, but there just really isn't. I can't just do an on-drill demo of an Altius or Fury just crashing into something. It just doesn't really work that way. So to your point, the DoD's response has been largely reactive. You look at COVID-19, spread across the globe in 9 months, killed 1.2 million Americans and wiped out 16 trillion in our GDP. It also took off for 10 weeks. We had an operational gap in the Pacific due to the USS Theodore Roosevelt. So it's very reactionary. So in terms of the Biological Weapons Convention, we should not be at the mercy and trust of other states. The U.S. has a somewhat of a grandstanding policy around this, which is that we will not build bioweapons, and the best offense is really stronger defense. The problem is that we have no defense. So we're kind of in this really precarious position right now where we are very vulnerable to a biological weapon attack. And we've seen that with COVID. We saw that very briefly with H5N1, but that didn't really have much spillover risk. So even if it's man-made or natural, it's still a threat. The reality is that most of our foreign adversaries are building out these laboratories. They're building out these weapons. In many ways, these systems tend to be referred to as poor man nukes because they're a lot cheaper and also don't really respect borders, so they can proliferate a lot faster and don't really require that direct confrontation. So it really underscores a frightening reality where these weapons can be used in really novel ways to really take down and break down the resilience of our military and also the critical infrastructure around the U.S. So even with the Biological Weapons Convention, there still is an outlasting and really real threat that's impeding with these systems.
How do you think about the legacy of Theranos? I'm sure if you're successful, people are going to be like, oh, this dropout, raising all this money, building this stuff. It's tough in bio because obviously there's so many real drugs that make it to market and quietly make billions or trillions of dollars. Novo Nordisk is bigger than the entire GDP of Denmark. But at the same time, it's harder for someone just to download the app and verify that it's a real thing like they can with a cursor, for example. What's your take on the legacy of Theranos?
So Theranos is obviously a very concerning, or was a very concerning situation. Elizabeth Holmes had basically this ability to keep the FDA out and prevent them, proper inspectors from coming in and checking out their work. And this is actually something I'm seeing again with non-invasive neuromodulation today. A lot of the companies in the space are building brain-computer interfaces and trying to circumvent the Food and Drug Administration by trying to fall into this general wellness category. I've seen dozens of companies do this. And right now, they're going to be fine, right? They'll get away with it for the time being. But if they hit $1 billion val, they're going to get a horrible enforcement action. At that point, it's fraud, right? So you can even be seeing jail time and you can be seeing massive fines. So it isn't like this cycle has gone away since Theranos. It's still very prominent. One thing that we do at Pilgrim, which is something I've been very adamant about since day one, is that we do that preliminary validation. So if we don't see the results on our benchtop, we don't even bring it to the US government. And the belief there is that we're trying to not only save taxpayer dollars, but also save our time. Like I don't have any interest in working on tech that doesn't work. So I want to see it work for myself. And clearly, if it wasn't clear with the demo I did on myself, I have a pretty high conviction to get to results, right? So on limited time, I had to cut holes in my legs on camera to demonstrate the rapid healing abilities of one of our composites. So that's sort of the approach we've taken. But in terms of Theranos' legacy, it obviously has scarred the biotech industry. I'm pretty bearish on biotech as a whole, which is a pretty hard thing to say being in the industry itself. But I just don't think many companies here are actually thinking about the practical and commercial implications of their work. Many people come in, they'll raise a couple million and buy like hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment and run with that idea, but not actually think about how they're going to make it to the market. And I think that's a really concerning reality when we're thinking about startups, even on that 10 to 15-year timeline.
Have you had any luck finding you have a roll up here called Pathfinder. It says, as a Pathfinder, you're the stormtrooper who stares down critical, near impossible challenges. You'll take on missions that break lesser souls, problems with no playbook, trekking into combat zones to deliver our tech, restoring a 90s scanning electron microscope without a manual, crashing a DARPA event with a fake badge to snag intel from top brass. Tasks so wild they'll call you insane. Has it been challenging to find the right person for that?
Transparently, no. We've gotten a lot of really compelling submissions for that. One thing I was very smart to do ahead of the announcement of the company was put like the question as part of the job post. So we've gotten some really interesting information out of people. So when people are, instead of just like submitting a bullshit application, they actually have to spend the time and write something compelling. But we found some really cool people. Like I said, our approach is very much based in guerrilla warfare, right? So we do what it really takes to get the meetings that we need to get. And thus far, it's worked very well in our favor. I think in many ways we're kind of battling a lot of entrenched interests. I somewhat compare, with limited perspective on precisely what it looked like, but I somewhat compare our experience to O5 Palantir, going up against the government, going up against these primes, and really trying to make a name, positioning ourselves in our company. So the Pathfinder role is one that I was really excited by. It really even like fired me up writing it. And we really wanted a stormtrooper who could go on the front lines. I could put them into combat environments and they would just kill it. If we need to get a meeting with SecDef, if we need them to break into a DARPA conference, if they need to go, beyond enemy lines, whatever it may be, we just needed somebody who would basically take the task, and sign off and get it done.
Needed an absolute dog. Well, I
have one more question.
One more question, then I'll cap it off.
Okay, cool. You talked about brain-computer interfaces. We've talked about this in the past. You know the industry very well. I don't know if you saw this, but a couple weeks ago, someone burned something close to like a couple $1 million of Ethereum to encode a message in the blockchain that alleged that China had developed brain-computer interface technology that was being used to control workers like ants. And it was very scary sounding sci-fi. If it's happening, it's terrifying. Why would someone spend so much money? Is this some sort of false flag, just try and freak out the Americans by spending this money? Is it even possible? What's your timeline for that type of thing? The Ender's Game of BCI, controlling all the soldiers on the battlefield. Give us the most sci-fi take you have.
So notably, first of all, I'll address the China thing. China is beating out the US in patents around neural interfaces. They've been doing that, I think, for a few years now. So they've really taken the lead. China also thrives on this belief of military-civil fusion. So basically any civilian corporation has a direct inline to the government for military applications. So, it's realistic in many ways that China is going to get there. And also, like I mentioned before, the US maintains somewhat of a grandstanding approach to bio. So, we've been pretty anti-modification or genetic enhancement of our warfighters for good reasons. But notably, that's going to inhibit our timeline to get to potentially the same outcomes that China might eventually move towards. So in terms of neural interfaces that can control warfighters, it's something I've looked into and something that I've explored. And there's a couple interesting modalities that are still semi or non-invasive. The biggest challenge with neural interfaces is spatial and temporal resolution. So most of the solutions today that rely on like EEG, you have really high temporal resolution. So you see the signal really, really quickly, but you're basically looking at a bowl of soup. It could be with millions of different things mixed in. You don't know precisely where that signal is coming from. And we've been leveraging AI. Like there's been researchers who've been using AI to like isolate it a little bit more, but non-invasive modalities are still pretty unclear. But in terms of a timeline or really approach to build technology that would be able to control the warfighter, it's a lot sooner than you would imagine.
Terrifying.
Terrifying. Amazing.
Well, thanks for breaking it
I'm
down.
glad you're doing what you're doing. Last thing I just want to leave you with, if you're working on anything that would help us do this show 24 hours a day for weeks in a row.
If you can just eliminate sleep entirely, that'd be great.
just get it over here.
We have Celsius, but we're looking for something stronger. Make it happen, Jake.
We're here. We appreciate you dog fooding your product. We'll step up. We're confident.
You can test the craziest stuff pre-FDA. We'll get ITAR compliant. We'll get regulated as a DoD effort if you need to test stuff on us.
Thank you for doing what you do. It's great
Appreciate
having you
you,
on.
Jake. Thanks for stopping by. We'll talk to you soon.